In the spring of 1615, Japan stood on the edge of unification and destruction. The skies over Osaka were choked with smoke. Not from factories or machines, but from burning villages, shattered homes, and thousands of funeral pyres. War drums echoed through the valleys as the Tokugawa shogunate prepared to strike the final blow. This is not a legend. It happened. The mighty Osaka Castle, once a symbol of power under the great warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi, now stood as the last bastion of resistance against Tokugawa Ieyasu, the new ruler who had declared himself shogun. Hideyoshi was dead, but his bloodline lived on, through his young and defiant son, Toyotomi Hideyori. The boy was no longer a child. He was a man of 22, but one whose fate was written long before he had the strength to resist it. And beside him stood his mother, Lady Yodo, a woman of iron will and bitter vengeance. She had lost a husband to the Tokugawa rise, and she would see no peace until that name was buried with the rest of them. Inside the castle walls, thousands of loyal samurai, ronin, and a shigeru rallied to the Toyotomi cause. They were outnumbered. Out-armed. Surrounded. But what they had was something the Tokugawa feared more than weapons, nothing to lose. Among them was Sanada Yukimura, the crimson demon of war. Once exiled. Now returned. Yukimura, born into the prestigious Sanada clan, had a reputation so fierce it bordered on myth. He had once stood against the Tokugawa and survived. Now, he stood once more, not for survival, but for honor, vengeance, and one last chance at glory. In the winter before the final battle, Tokugawa's armies had laid siege to Osaka Castle. The fighting was brutal, and though the outer walls held firm, negotiations were forced upon the Toyotomi. A false peace. The castle's defenses were torn down brick by brick under the promise of safety. But peace was never Ieyasu's intention. Spring came, and so did the second siege, deadlier than before. This time, Tokugawa would not stop at surrender. He wanted total annihilation. Inside the great halls of Osaka Castle, Hideyori gathered his generals. Tension crackled through the air. Some urged surrender. Others feared betrayal. But Yukimura stood, calm and unwavering. "We cannot match them in numbers," he said, "but we can bleed them until their victory tastes like ash." And so, a plan was forged. Yukimura would lead a daring sortie, carving a path through the enemy ranks to break their siege lines. In secret, tunnels were dug beneath the castle grounds. Scouts watched every Tokugawa movement. Messages flew by falcon and hidden couriers. The resistance was no longer just a defense, it was a counterstrike. But as strategy unfolded, shadows twisted behind the scenes. Within the Toyotomi ranks were spies, men bought with gold, others with fear. Ieyasu had planted them well. Every whispered word in the war room risked being carried to enemy ears. Betrayal would come, but no one yet knew the name of the traitor. And in the Tokugawa camp, the old shogun himself watched the smoke rise above the city. He was in his 70s now. A master of patience. He had united Japan in name, but this last ember, the Toyotomi line, refused to die out. "Let it burn," he said to his commanders. "Every stone, every banner. Let no one remember the name Hideyoshi." What followed would be the bloodiest, most relentless siege in Japan's history. But inside Osaka Castle, none spoke of death. Only of legacy. And in the crimson light of dawn, Yukimura rode out, armor gleaming red, toward a fate he already knew. The final defense had begun. Before the first spear was thrown, before the first torch was lit, the warriors inside Osaka Castle already understood what they faced. They were trapped. The second siege, launched by Tokugawa in the spring of 1615, was not a simple encirclement. It was a noose tightening by the hour. Over 150,000 men had gathered under the Tokugawa banner, a colossal army, the largest Japan had ever seen. Inside the castle, fewer than 60,000 stood ready. But numbers did not define men like Sanada Yukimura. When he rode out from the south gate on the morning of May 6, his crimson armor gleamed like a dying sun. Every man who followed him knew they were not marching to victory. They were marching into legend. His target, Tokugawa Ieyasu's command post at Chaosuyama, a hill position just outside the southern walls. If Yukimura could strike deep enough, fast enough, the siege might collapse from the inside. It was a gamble born from desperation, but also genius. His men surged forward, a wedge of fire and steel cutting through Tokugawa's outer lines. Surprise favored them. Several camps fell in minutes. Panic rippled through enemy ranks. Ieyasu, watching from a distance, was forced to shift his command post, momentarily stunned by Yukimura's speed. For a moment, it seemed the impossible might happen. But then came the counterattack. Tokugawa generals, veterans of countless battles, responded with cold precision. They knew Yukimura's tactics. They had studied his movements. Traps were laid. Paths were closed. Arrows fell like rain. Yukimura's forces were pinned near a narrow ravine. He ordered a feint retreat, then turned it into a brutal ambush. Dozens of Tokugawa samurai were cut down, their banners trampled in the mud. The ground itself turned red. But time was not on their side. For every Tokugawa unit Yukimura defeated, 3 more advanced. The resistance was heroic, but slowly, steadily, the hammer fell. Sanada's men were forced to fall back toward the castle. And then, disaster struck. As Yukimura's men retreated, the inner fortress gates, damaged during the earlier siege, jammed. For precious minutes, they stood exposed. Arrows sliced through the air. Men screamed. Yukimura himself took a spear to the thigh but refused to fall. With his blood soaking the ground, he shouted to his remaining troops. "Hold the line. Every second we stand is a second stolen from their victory." His voice was thunder. His eyes, fire. Finally, the gates gave way. The defenders rushed back into the stronghold. But they had paid in blood. Of the 2,000 who rode out with Yukimura, fewer than 800 returned. Inside the castle, whispers began to spread. Not of defeat, but of betrayal. How had Tokugawa known Yukimura's route? Why had the gate failed at the worst possible time? Rumors flickered like candle flames. One of Hideyori's advisors had been seen speaking to an unknown messenger days before. But nothing could be proven. Not yet. As night fell over Osaka, silence settled across the bloodied fields. Tokugawa's men tended their wounds, reset their positions, and watched the walls for signs of weakness. Inside the castle, Yukimura limped to the top of the ramparts. Beside him stood Hideyori and Lady Yodo. The young lord's face was pale. "Is it the end?" he asked quietly. Yukimura did not answer right away. His gaze was locked on the enemy campfires stretching across the hills like stars fallen to earth. "No," he said. "Not yet. We still have fire left to burn." And in that moment, beneath the weight of betrayal and the shadow of defeat, the defenders of Osaka did not see a wounded man. They saw a leader. The kind that history does not forget. The siege had entered its darkest stage. Tokugawa's army pressed from every direction, their encampments growing like weeds around Osaka Castle. Food supplies dwindled. Water was rationed. Spirits wore thin. But inside the stone walls, a far more dangerous enemy lurked, paranoia. Sanada Yukimura, still recovering from his wounds, summoned the castle's inner council. Generals, advisors, and commanders filled the chamber. Silence reigned as he looked each of them in the eye. "There is a traitor among us," he said. No one moved. And yet everyone knew it was true. The previous day's near-disaster during Yukimura's counterattack had not been bad luck. Gate malfunctions don't happen twice without reason. And Tokugawa's uncanny ability to predict troop movements pointed to leaks from within. Lady Yodo demanded answers. Her tone, sharp and commanding, revealed the fire she had inherited from her father, Oda Nobunaga. "Someone here is feeding Ieyasu our plans," she declared. "And if we do not find him, our next breath may be our last." All eyes turned toward Ono Harunaga, a close advisor to Hideyori and a man once loyal to Hideyoshi. But war changes men. Yukimura ordered discreet surveillance. Messengers were tracked. Letters intercepted. Within days, undeniable proof surfaced. Harunaga had sent encrypted scrolls out of the castle under the guise of peace negotiations. He was dragged before the council in chains. "I did what I must," Harunaga said, unrepentant. "Hideyori is too young. Lady Yodo too proud. This war cannot be won. I sought to save our bloodline, not destroy it." But Yukimura saw the truth. "You sold your honor," he said, "for the promise of a seat at the enemy's table." Harunaga was sentenced to death. But not in silence. Before his execution, he shouted to the castle walls, "The Toyotomi are finished. Even you, Yukimura, know it." His words lingered like smoke. That night, Lady Yodo wept for the first time in years. Not for Harunaga, but for the slow crumbling of loyalty. What remained inside Osaka Castle was not a unified army, but a patchwork of desperation and fading faith. Yet Yukimura pressed on. In secret, he began reinforcing the Sanadamaru, a fortified outpost he had designed himself during the first siege. Though much of it had been torn down in the false peace, his men worked day and night to restore it. It would be the anvil against which Tokugawa's forces would break. Meanwhile, Hideyori, once quiet and uncertain, began to change. The weight of command hardened him. He ordered new positions, reviewed plans personally, and addressed the soldiers himself. A boy no longer, he was becoming a warlord. "I was born in this castle," he told his troops. "I will die in it before I surrender it." The men roared. Outside the walls, Tokugawa Ieyasu watched with growing unease. The defenders, though starved and battered, refused to break. His son, Hidetada, urged a direct assault. But Ieyasu was cautious. "Let them rot," he said. "Pride burns fast when the belly is empty." And so, the noose tightened. Bridges were cut. Rivers blocked. Tokugawa's army dug trenches and set fire to fields. The goal was no longer to conquer the castle, but to strangle it into silence. Inside, Yukimura returned to the walls. His body weak. His eyes sharper than ever. He whispered to himself, "Let them come." Because he knew, when the final battle came, it would not be fought with arrows or walls. It would be fought with will. By late May, the siege of Osaka had become a slow execution. Tokugawa Ieyasu's army, now reinforced and more confident, had built an iron ring around the castle, earthworks, trenches, barricades, watchtowers. Not a single pigeon could fly from the walls without being shot down. Supply lines were choked. Starvation had become a strategy. Inside, Osaka Castle was cracking. Men fought over scraps of rice. Mothers whispered lullabies to children with sunken eyes. The stench of the dead lingered behind sealed rooms. Still, no one spoke of surrender. Not openly. Sanada Yukimura, though wounded, continued to inspect the lines. Word of his resolve kept morale alive, even as rations disappeared. His red armor, now faded from blood and dust, became a symbol. Soldiers carved the Sanada crest into their helmets. They no longer fought for Hideyori. They fought for him. Lady Yodo grew colder by the day. She dismissed any talk of retreat. Her son Hideyori, once submissive, now challenged her decisions. Their arguments became louder, less about strategy and more about legacy. "We cannot win this," he said one night. "We cannot lose," she replied. "Not while we still breathe." But time showed no mercy. On the morning of June 3, Tokugawa ordered his final assault. The strategy was cruelly brilliant, simultaneous attacks on multiple fronts, north, east, and south, designed to overwhelm the castle before it could respond. Fires were set across the outer town to blind the defenders. Cannons, dragged through mud for weeks, were finally unleashed. The ground shook. Walls splintered. And then, they came, thousands upon thousands of men, charging with spears, muskets, and banners snapping in the smoke. They moved like a living wave, shouting the names of their clans, their ancestors, their vengeance. Yukimura had been waiting. From the Sanadamaru, he unleashed a brutal counterstrike. His gunners opened fire at point-blank range. Smoke filled the air, and screams echoed down the valley. Twice the enemy surged. Twice they were thrown back. But on the third, they broke through. The eastern gate fell. Chaos exploded within the walls. Hideyori's guards clashed with invading troops in the courtyards. The sacred drum of Osaka, once used to summon generals, was smashed to pieces. Lady Yodo stood on a high balcony, watching the flames climb toward the sky. "We've reached the end," she said, her voice calm. Below, Hideyori took one last look at the castle that had been his prison, his kingdom, and now his tomb. He gave the final order. "Burn it." Servants lit the inner stores. Archives, treasures, and scrolls of the Toyotomi legacy turned to ash. What the Tokugawa couldn't take, they would not have. Yukimura fought until he could no longer stand. With only a dozen men, he broke through the enemy's final line and charged directly toward Ieyasu's camp. Some say he reached within a sword's length of the shogun before collapsing. Others say he smiled as he fell. His last words, spoken to a Tokugawa officer. "I am Sanada Yukimura. For a warrior, there is no better end than this." By sunset, the castle was lost. Hideyori and Lady Yodo, surrounded and out of options, retreated into the inner sanctum. There, they took their own lives, choosing death over humiliation. Their bodies were never shown to the public. The Tokugawa victory was complete. But at a price. Over 10,000 dead. Half the castle in ruins. And in the minds of many, a stain on honor that would never wash clean. That night, Ieyasu stood among the wreckage. Osaka Castle was his now. But the fire of resistance, of loyalty, of honor, had not been extinguished. It had been burned into the memory of Japan forever. The morning after the siege, Osaka Castle stood in silence. What remained was a graveyard. Charred wood. Broken stone. The banners of fallen clans lay buried beneath soot and ash. Smoke drifted upward like ghosts refusing to rest. Where once 60,000 defenders stood, only silence remained. Tokugawa Ieyasu entered through the ruined gates, not in triumph, but in calculation. His expression revealed no joy, only certainty. The final threat to his rule was gone. The Toyotomi line, begun by his rival Hideyoshi, had ended in blood and flame. Yet, even in victory, danger lingered. Rumors swirled among the surviving soldiers. Some whispered that Hideyori had escaped through hidden tunnels beneath the keep. Others swore Lady Yodo's body had not been found. Tokugawa ordered all tunnels sealed, all corpses examined, and every survivor questioned. None could confirm their fate. To the public, Tokugawa announced it plainly, "Hideyori and his mother are dead. Let no one speak of their name again." But legends, once born, do not die easily. In the days that followed, executions swept the countryside. Lords and samurai who had sided with the Toyotomi were either stripped of rank, exiled, or beheaded. The Sanada clan, what remained of it, was dissolved. Their lands taken. Their name forbidden. The Tokugawa shogunate, at last, stood unchallenged. Ieyasu retired from power shortly after. His son, Tokugawa Hidetada, assumed full control as shogun. But the old man, even in retirement, pulled the strings from behind a curtain of advisors and emissaries. He had achieved what no warlord before him had managed, a unified Japan under a single rule. But at what cost? In the provinces, surviving ronin, masterless samurai, roamed in silence. Many were former defenders of Osaka. Men who had fought under Yukimura or sworn oaths to the Toyotomi. Some vanished into the mountains. Others became mercenaries or outlaws. One such ronin, a young man named Shima Genjiro, had served under Yukimura's banner. His left arm bore the burn marks of the Sanadamaru's final stand. He refused to kneel to Tokugawa authority. Instead, he wandered from village to village, spreading the story of Yukimura's final charge. Wherever he went, peasants listened in awe. Children whispered the tale at night. And slowly, something unexpected began to take root, not rebellion, but remembrance. Temples were built in secret to honor the dead. Poems carved into stone walls. A red sash, once the mark of Yukimura's troops, became a quiet symbol of resistance. Not of violence, but of legacy. Meanwhile, within Edo Castle, Tokugawa advisors worried. The people still whisper the name Sanada, one warned. Let them whisper, Ieyasu replied. They have no swords left. But he knew better. You can break armies. You can burn castles. But stories survive. Years later, Ieyasu's grandson would sit on the shogun's throne. And by then, the siege of Osaka had already become legend. A tale of pride. Of courage. Of betrayal and impossible loyalty. And the name Sanada Yukimura? It would echo through generations. Not as a rebel. Not as a failure. But as a hero who stood when others knelt. After the fires of Osaka were smothered, the Tokugawa regime moved quickly to erase the past. Edicts were issued. Shrines desecrated. Any mention of the Toyotomi name was forbidden. Even those who whispered it in dreams could be dragged away for questioning. The land was at peace, but it was a peace carved by fear. In Edo, Tokugawa Ieyasu sat behind thick paper walls and painted screens, no longer the warrior general of old. He wore silk robes now, but his mind remained sharp as a blade. From the shadows, he guided his son Hidetada and grandson Imitsu like a puppeteer. He knew the ghosts of Osaka were not gone. One of those ghosts now walked the roads of central Japan, Shima Genjiro, the ronin marked by fire and memory. Each village he entered, he spoke not of vengeance, but of the truth, how Hideyori had once united men of every province, how Yukimura had faced thousands with only honor in his hands, how betrayal had been bought with gold and fear. The Tokugawa men hunted him. Posters bearing crude drawings of his face lined the roads. But he stayed one step ahead, hiding in farmhouses, teaching sword forms to orphans, passing the Sanada tale like a torch. Meanwhile, in Kyoto, the imperial court remained a hollow shell. The emperor, little more than a prisoner in silk, sent ceremonial gifts to Edo, acknowledging the Tokugawa as rulers. But within the court, silent protests were mounted. Paintings hidden behind scrolls. Haiku that told of red banners falling but not forgotten. Among the old samurai class, something deeper stirred. Many had fought for Tokugawa simply to survive. But now, seeing the crushing grip of the shogunate, they wondered if they had backed the wrong master. They gathered in tea houses and temples, speaking in riddles and codes. A poem. A flower left on a windowsill. A red thread tied to a sword hilt. Whispers began to circulate of a secret order, men who had once served the Toyotomi and refused to believe that Hideyori had died. They called themselves the Hoketsu, the Resurgence. Some believed that Hideyori had indeed escaped that day in Osaka, led through tunnels by loyal guards, his death faked to mislead the Tokugawa. Others admitted he was dead but believed his child, hidden by servants, still lived in disguise among commoners. Truth or not, it didn't matter. Belief was enough. And belief, Ieyasu knew, was dangerous. He ordered the Hoketsu hunted. Their families detained. Samurai who had once dined in Edo were now questioned at sword point. Spies were embedded in temples, monasteries, merchant houses. But belief spreads faster than fear. And Genjiro, the wandering ronin, had become more than a man. He was now the voice of the fallen. One winter night, he met with an old monk who had once served as a messenger inside Osaka Castle. The monk spoke slowly, eyes clouded with age, but his words were clear. "Do you know why Yukimura fought, even when defeat was certain?" Genjiro nodded. "Because some things are worth losing for." The monk handed him a scroll, weathered and bound in red silk. Inside, a map. Not of cities or roads. But of names. Families. Places where the blood of the Toyotomi still beat. Genjiro bowed. His mission had just changed. No longer would he only carry the memory. He would protect the last embers. The scroll carried by Genjiro was not merely a relic. It was a key. Inside were names, some crossed out, others circled. Children of loyal retainers, hidden in villages under false surnames. Servants who had smuggled Toyotomi heirlooms away in rice carts. Disgraced samurai who had vanished after the fall of Osaka, presumed dead but perhaps merely waiting. Each name, each mark, was a potential spark. And the scroll's final entry bore no name at all, just the symbol of a chrysanthemum drawn in red ink. In the world of the shogunate, the imperial chrysanthemum meant only one thing, the emperor. Genjiro stared at it long into the night. It was a message, hidden in plain sight. The Toyotomi had tried to save their bloodline, not only by defending Osaka, but by tying it to something older, something even the Tokugawa feared. A child. A legacy. A last chance. But as Genjiro traveled deeper into the provinces, he saw how well Tokugawa had cemented their grip. In each town, garrisons were posted. Farmers paid triple taxes. Ronin were questioned at every gate. Public squares displayed the heads of those who spoke out. Still, the Hoketsu moved in silence. Genjiro met with a young woman named Aya in the mountains of Ki province. She was barely 20 but had command over a network of couriers disguised as weavers. Her father had died in the fire of Osaka. She trained in secret, using a short sword and fan to deflect attacks. Together, they followed the scroll's trail, through burned-out temples, forgotten tunnels, and abandoned watchposts. They found what remained of the old Toyotomi guard, a blacksmith missing a hand who still sharpened blades, a farmer who buried muskets beneath his fields, a blind court musician who remembered every face in Hideyori's court. Each one was a piece of a broken sword. And Genjiro meant to reforge it. But Tokugawa's spies were closing in. One night, in a village nestled near Lake Biwa, an ambush came. Dozens of Ashigaru stormed the safe house, blades drawn. Genjiro and Aya escaped only because of a secret tunnel beneath the floor, carved decades earlier by ninja allied with the Sonata. Outside, snow fell in silence as blood darkened the earth. Aya turned to Genjiro. "They know." He nodded. "It doesn't matter. We have what we need." Because now, the scroll was complete. Not in ink, but in memory. They no longer needed paper. They had the path. And as they headed east, toward a forgotten monastery rumored to be the child's last refuge, word of their journey spread like wildfire. Villagers began placing red cloth on their doorposts at night. Old samurai left their swords outside their homes, blades pointed toward the capital. The Tokugawa believed they had crushed the last embers. But embers, when stoked, become flame. And that flame was coming. Winter deepened as Genjiro and Aya neared the Koyasan Mountains. The monastery they sought was said to be hidden between peaks, built not of stone, but silence. It did not appear on maps. It had no official name. Yet it was whispered that inside its walls lived a child born during the fall of Osaka, a child with the blood of Toyotomi Hideyori. The last hope. As they approached, the air turned sharp, the snow thick. Footprints vanished behind them. No one spoke. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. It was Aya who saw it first, carved into the bark of a cedar tree, the Sonata 6-coin crest. They followed the sign. Deep within the trees, guarded by mist and shadow, the monastery rose, modest, wooden, timeless. No guards. No gates. Only an old monk tending a fire. He said nothing as they approached. He only stared. "I've come for the child," Genjiro said. Still, no answer. Then the monk turned and walked inside. They followed. There, sitting by a low hearth, was a boy of about 13. His hair was tied back. His kimono plain. But his eyes held something ancient. Aya dropped to her knees. Genjiro bowed. The boy stood, uncertain. The monk finally spoke. He knows what he is. But not yet what he must become. For years, the child had been raised as a temple apprentice. Fed old stories. Trained in both sword and brush. Protected by monks who had once served the court of Kyoto and lost everything when the shogunate rose. Genjiro stepped forward. "They will come for him." "They already are," the monk replied. That night, they made a choice. No more hiding. If the boy was to live, he must become more than a symbol. He must be protected, trained, hidden again, until the time was right. But the Tokugawa were closer than they knew. In Edo, Ieyasu's spies had traced Genjiro's trail across the provinces. The scroll. The old guard. The red cloths. He knew something was building, not a rebellion, but a memory weaponized. Ieyasu summoned his most loyal general, Sakai Tadakatsu. "Burn the mountain," he said. And so, a strike force moved, elite men hardened by war, armed with musket and matchlock. They ascended the Koyasan path under moonlight, leaving no witness behind. But the monks were ready. What followed was not a battle, it was a reckoning. Blades flashed in the snow. Arrows sang from the trees. The monastery became a fortress. Genjiro fought like a man possessed, cutting down enemies with the calm of purpose. Aya held the rear, leading the boy through a hidden passage toward a waiting caravan. The monks, one by one, fell, but never surrendered. By dawn, the monastery burned. But the boy had escaped. They rode west, into obscurity. The child hidden once more. The path vanished behind them. But the Tokugawa now understood. The Toyotomi legacy was not a corpse. It was a heartbeat. The fires of the Koyasan monastery still smoked in Tokugawa reports. They called it a minor disturbance, but Ieyasu knew better. The boy had escaped. He summoned his council. "Legends," he said, "are more dangerous than swords. If this ghost becomes a rallying cry, we'll face another Osaka." Across the provinces, Tokugawa forces cracked down harder than ever. Families were questioned. Secret texts seized. Red cloths, once hung in silent tribute, were now punishable by death. Even retired samurai were dragged from their homes. But they were too late. The name of Sanada Yukimura had become more than history. It was now a code, spoken in the alleys of Kyoto, in tea-houses of Nara, and even among the merchants of Edo. And behind every whispered story was a quiet oath. "When the heir returns, we rise." Genjiro, Aya, and the boy vanished into the vast western provinces, lands still bearing scars of the old Toyotomi alliance. Protected by merchants, monks, and retired warriors, they trained in secret. The boy, now called Haruki, learned fast. He mastered the sword, but also the art of patience. He studied maps of old Osaka, memorized the mistakes of his ancestors, and read every letter written by Hideyoshi and Hideyori. Though only 13, his mind was sharp. His resolve, unshakable. One night, Aya sat beside him as they camped near the inland sea. "You don't have to carry this burden," she said. He looked at her, calm. "I don't carry it. I am it." Genjiro, now older and slower, watched with quiet pride. He had survived the fall of a castle, the betrayal of friends, and the wrath of the shogunate. But this child, was the proof that everything they had lost still had meaning. And then, something no one expected. News arrived from Edo. Tokugawa Ieyasu was dead. The man who had destroyed Osaka, crushed the Toyotomi, and united the land, was gone. His grandson, Imitsu, had assumed the title of shogun. Young. Ambitious. Paranoid. For a moment, the land held its breath. In that silence, the Hoketsu began to move. From the ashes of fear came letters, tokens, banners once hidden in closets. Old retainers, gray and limping, met in remote shrines. Younger men, trained in secret, pledged themselves to the heir. But Genjiro gave a warning. "We are not here to start another war. We are here to remind Japan what it almost forgot." A final message was sent across the sea, to foreign traders still lurking in the shadows of Nagasaki. The Portuguese. The Dutch. Those who remembered the old Toyotomi ports. Those who still owed debts. What came in return was unexpected. A ship. Old, rusted, and hidden in a cove, but seaworthy. Aya smiled. "What do we do now?" Genjiro answered simply, "We vanish." And they did. The child of Toyotomi, guarded by ghosts, disappeared from Japan's shores, only stories left behind. Years passed. Japan changed. Under the Tokugawa shogunate, peace settled over the land like frost, quiet, still, and cold. Roads were built. Temples restored. The sword gave way to the brush. But beneath it all, beneath the masks of civility, something ancient still stirred. The story of Osaka Castle refused to fade. Children played games where they took turns as yukimura, charging impossible odds. Secret songs were sung by street performers about a red-armored warrior who defied the world. And in the borderlands, rumors spread of a wandering man and a quiet boy with noble eyes. They never stayed long. They asked no favors. But wherever they appeared, justice followed. One year, in a small village in Chikuzen province, a corrupt magistrate vanished after demanding unfair taxes. In his place, villagers found a sword driven into the ground, wrapped in a red cloth. No note. No name. Only a sign. By the time Shogun Imitsu heard of it, the story had spread too far to erase. Agents were sent. Witnesses questioned. But all they found were ashes and footprints that led to the sea. Some believed the child had died. Others said he was raised in foreign lands, waiting for the moment Japan needed him most. The truth was known to few, but it no longer mattered. Because what Ieyasu had tried to destroy was not just a family. It was an idea. That honor could stand against power. That courage could outlive defeat. That sometimes, the greatest victory, was refusing to kneel. In hidden shrines across the country, small statues were built, not of gods, but of men. A lone warrior in crimson armor. A young lord holding a broken sword. A woman with a fan and fire in her eyes. No names. Only memory. And so, the last defense of Osaka Castle became something far greater than a battle. It became a legend. One that would never die. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want more epic tales from history, folklore, and forgotten battles, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with fellow fans of samurai legends.